I'm Dr. Rachel Pigg, an assistant professor at University of Louisville. For this biography interview, I'm talking today with Dr. Suann Yang, who is an associate professor at SUNY Geneseo. Suann and I have worked together for many years and are good friends. Welcome, Suann.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Suann is first author on a paper called Pollinator Behavior Mediates Negative Interactions Between Two Congeneric Invasive Plant Species, and it's published in the American Naturalist. Today, we'd like to chat about your hypotheses from that paper and some of the graphs that you made in Figure 3. How does that sound?
Awesome.
So tell us about the research in Figure 3b that you've subtitled Quantity of Visits.
Well, pollinators like bees and butterflies are attracted to patches of flowering plants that have more food resources. And what we did is we studied the relative attractiveness of two different closely related plant species, and they're commonly called the plumeless thistle and the musk thistle. For both species, we found that individual plants in larger patches were visited more often than individual plants in smaller patches. But it was interesting that the effect was more pronounced for the plumeless thistle, and that suggests that this species has characteristics that are more attractive to pollinators compared to the musk thistle.
Wow, that's an interesting result, Suann. So what does the second graph show in Figure 3c that you've subtitled Quality of Visits?
Oh, good question. So from a plant's point of view, having fewer or a lower quantity of visits by pollinators could mean that reproduction is less successful. However, when we tracked how pollinators were actually moving between individual plants, the species that was visited less often by pollinators, that's the musk thistle, was more likely to receive visits by pollinators that came from other individuals of the same species. This is because pollinators didn't actually stick around on any single musk thistle plant for long. In contrast, a pollinator that landed on an individual plumeless thistle would hang out on that same individual plant for a really long time, feeding at different flowering parts of the same plant. The difference between these two species is that the musk thistle has relatively few but really large flowering structures. In contrast, the plumeless thistle, the species that receives the most visits, had lots of small flowering structures. So it seems that pollinators were preferring to dine where their food is kind of spread out somewhat at the small scale of an individual plant, but is more concentrated when you're thinking about the scale of the whole patch of plants.
That's neat that the scale matters for pollinator behavior. Very cool result. So taken together, what do these results mean from these two graphs?
Yeah, so altogether, it seems that the plumeless thistle species is more attractive to pollinators. However, individuals of the species are less likely to get pollen from diverse sources.
So what sort of follow-up experiments did you do?
Well, we wanted to find out if the less attractive species, that's the musk thistle, regained some kind of competitive advantage through having a greater diversity of pollen sources. So we performed hand pollinations, and we did those to see if seed formation relies on having more diverse pollen donors. It turns out that both the species that we studied are pretty successful at using self-pollination for seed production, so they don't need to have diverse sources in order to produce seeds.
Very neat that they're both successful at seed production. So what's the significance of this research in your view?
Well, I think it matters for species that can self-pollinate. More self-pollination results in less genetic diversity for a population of plants compared to populations where there's more pollination across individual plants. We call that outcrossing. Both the plant species that we studied are introduced to North America from Europe and Asia and classified as invasive species. So it's useful to know how the interactions between species, between the pollinators and the plants, between the plants and each other, how that might influence changes in genetic diversity from the initial introduction of a new species compared to later after the species are established.
Very neat, Suann. Big implications for invasive species management. So now I'd like to ask you a few questions about being a scientist and how you became a scientist. How does that sound?
Great.
Awesome. So what kinds of scientific questions interest you the most?
Well, I'm interested in how the interactions between species shapes the biodiversity of communities, and then also how the structure of communities and ecosystems feeds back into influencing the interactions between species.
Very cool. So once you collected data, what do you do if you have questions about how to analyze it?
Well, it depends. If I know what I'm trying to do and I'm stuck, I'll take a break and do something else for a while away from my computer. If I have a question, I usually look it up on the internet or I ask for help. I do all of my data analysis using the R programming environment. That's an open source software with a huge community of volunteer software developers and users who are really very willing to help anyone with their questions, no matter how big or small.
That's so great that there's a community to support scientists as they learn new ways to analyze their data. So when and how did you know you wanted to be a scientist?
Well, actually, I didn't always know I wanted to be a scientist. However, I definitely remember being interested in science in high school. I took some awesome courses for high school science credit at the Fernbank Science Center and Museum of Natural History in Atlanta, Georgia, where I grew up. I got some great field ecology experiences there, and those definitely were part of the reason why I decided to pursue an undergrad degree in biology, specifically ecology.
So great that you grew up in Atlanta. I have family there. It's a great city. So after you figured out that you wanted to be a scientist, what did you do next? Tell us about the paths that led you to your current job.
Well, it's not as straight as it might appear. When I started my undergrad degree, I knew I had interest in ecology. In contrast, my parents really wanted me to become a medical doctor. I understand I'm not the only child of Asian American parents who have this desire for their children. So I did my best to follow both paths. I took classes like wetland ecology while also volunteering at a hospital and taking the MCAT. I definitely felt like I was disappointing my parents on the one hand by following the path towards ecology. But on the other hand, both of them, as well as my siblings, have degrees beyond college. And so we always have been able to find common ground in how important education is. At first, after earning my PhD, a job as a professor wasn't really on my radar. Research was all that I knew and loved. I do still love research, just so you know. But even after I was a lecturer in a class for the first time, I didn't actually like it all that much. That all changed after a good friend of mine invited me to apply to a teaching fellowship with her. And I discovered for myself that teaching is not only fun, it allows me to exercise my creativity and most importantly, help people.
You mentioned that you identify as an Asian American. What is it like being a scientist with this identity?
Well, there are not that many Asian American ecologists in the US, though there are a lot of Asians and Asian Americans in other fields of biology. So far, I haven't really met that many other ecologists who look like me. So while it's a little lonely, I'm actually lucky that this lack of representation hasn't been a huge barrier to my work. One of the worst instances that I've experienced, it may have been a reviewer who suggested that a manuscript that I had written with others should be edited by a native English speaker. I am a native English speaker. Fortunately, another reviewer had thought it was one of the most well-written papers they had read.
I'm so sorry they made that assumption about your identity based on your name.
Yeah, thank you. It did hurt. But you know, writing ability really doesn't correlate to when a person learns to speak English. In fact, my co-authors learned to speak English in school, but they're excellent writers. So the reviewer was also making incorrect assumptions about them as well. So because of experiences like these and my background, I especially relate to students who may be immigrants or whose parents are immigrants and want to support their success.
Thank you for supporting them and for sharing that experience with us. So I'm sure some students would like to know what a typical day is like for you. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Well, no 2 days are the same, but I do try to start them and end them the same way. Before I go to work, I like to get some exercise with our dog. And then most days during the academic year, I teach 1, 2, sometimes 3 classes. So a lot of time is spent preparing for class, helping students learn in class, and reviewing their work and providing feedback on it. All of my research is with undergrad students too. So I spend a fair bit of time working with them. I think I'd say that the bulk of each day is spent working together with other people, either students or my faculty colleagues. Then when I get home, the first thing I do is a dog walk, no matter what the weather is, snow, rain, whatever. I'm also a knitter, so I try to knit a bit each day for some visible, tangible progress on something.
That sounds similar to my typical day, but I don't knit. So maybe one day you can teach me how to do that.
Sure thing.
So tell me about a moment when you felt like you really belonged in the field of science.
Well, right now, when someone thinks my research is interesting enough to want to talk to me about it, I know I belong. It shows me I'm connected to the broader community because I'm studying something that is important or useful, or someone can learn something from it.
Well, you certainly belong, Suann, and thanks so much for chatting with us today. We've learned a lot.
Thanks, Rachel, for the opportunity to share my work.
If you want to learn more about this work, you can read Pollinator Behavior Mediates Negative Interactions Between Two Congeneric Invasive Plant Species, which was published in the American Naturalist in 2011. We've included a link to it below this video.